So, what does the UK, China, India, South Korea, Russia, and Brazil all have in common? We, alongside those countries, are losing more millionaires than any other country across the globe. What's worse is we are losing more than all those countries I just mentioned combined. So what do you think the UAE, US, Italy, and Switzerland all have in common? They're the opposite. They're attracting more millionaires than anyone else. So if you own property, invest in property, or you're desperately trying to step on the ladder, I've got some bad news, sadly, and I hate to be negative. I just think it's really important I share the unvarnished truth, the data of what's happening right now. Because Labour, Conservatives, to be frank, I'm just not sure on Reform or Lib Dems because they haven't had any recent track record in government. But governments don't seem to have a clue how to fix UK housing. And after 13 years of building a national property business myself, British Homebuyers and British Homesellers, and across those businesses managing over £5 billion worth of property transactions, I'm going to explain exactly how both our current and past political parties are getting it wrong across three key areas, why things might get worse, and crucially what it means for you. So hopefully the solution will become obvious to you as you watch this. So let's start with the Labour's Renters' Rights Bill, short-term gain, long-term pain. Remember, Conservatives had a very similar bill as well. So the Labour's Renters' Rights Bill is making its way through the House of Lords and currently is expected to come into force between October and January. And let's start with what the purpose is of this bill, because the whole point of it is to improve the rental sector for everyone, for tenants, for landlords. It's meant to be a good thing for everyone. The official purpose of the bill, in the government's own words, is to provide a fairer, more secure and higher quality private rented sector for both tenants and responsible landlords. What's not to like from that statement? Why should there be any hate towards it? But how can we objectively assess if it's achieving that goal? Well, there was a report commissioned by the government to offer an independent assessment on if the Renters' Rights Bill achieves that very purpose. The government commissioned this report, the English Private Landlord Survey, published December just gone. It's a government-commissioned evidence-gathering survey of private landlords in England. It's designed to be neutral, statistical, and descriptive. So you'd expect government would look at this report, this data, and adjust policy based on it to better improve what they're doing. Now, this report shares 4 core problems that I'd be interested to know if those of you watching renting have experienced. Comment below what you think. But the first issue was poor property standards. 47% of landlords have at least one property with an EPC rating of D or below. Lots of reports of damp, mould and disrepair still very common, and many landlords don't actually plan to improve this, especially in older or low rent properties. The second thing is tenant discrimination. 95% of landlords admit they refuse to let to at least one group, such as tenants on benefits, tenants with children, tenants with pets. So blanket bans are still widely used, especially it finds by letting agents. The third thing is an increased reliance on lettings agents, especially among larger landlords. So those with 5 or more properties. Now, agents generally apply a rigid criteria. They don't make exceptions for people, they just follow a process. And so tenants often report less flexibility and more bureaucracy when dealing with letting agents as opposed to individual small landlords. And the fourth, fragmentation or informality. So a large proportion of landlords are accidental or part-time. As a result, many are just unaware of their legal obligations or just fail to comply with them. So compliance rates vary widely by landlord type and region. So look, clearly there are problems that no doubt need to be fixed. No doubt in my mind about it. But interestingly, the report also found that 45% of landlords own one property, with 17% owning 5 or more, making up 49% of all tenancies. So I guess, as you'd expect, a minority of people own pretty much half the buy-to-let sector. And this is probably the most important part of the report's findings, because there are major behavioural differences by landlord size that, to be honest, really surprised me, and are really key that you listen to this. The first is eviction behaviour. So large landlords with 5 or more properties are twice as likely to have evicted a tenant in the past 12 months. 10% of large landlords evicted a tenant, compared to just 5% of small landlords. So it found larger landlords objectively are more commercially driven and more likely to use legal process to manage risk or tenant issues, even if that means eviction. The second key thing is rent increases. Large landlords are significantly more likely to raise rent between tenancies or during renewals. So 75% of large landlords increased rent for new tenancies. 63% increased rent on renewals. Small landlords are statistically far more likely to hold rent steady, especially for long-term tenants. So it found small landlords are often more lenient or emotionally invested in the tenants because they know them. Larger landlords adjust rent based on the market. They aren't as emotionally invested in the tenant because they have so many of them. The third is the tenant types accepted. So it actually found small landlords are slightly more likely to accept tenants on benefits or with children, especially if the landlord self-manages the property. Large landlords often use letting agents who apply blanket policies more consistently. They're following a process, so they'll go no DSS or no pets or no children. So it found small landlords may be more flexible and assess tenants on a case-by-case basis. Larger landlords often apply risk-averse blanket policies on everything. And the final fourth thing is property conditions. Large landlords are actually more likely to own older housing stock, so pre-1945, which correlates with more damp, mould reports, lower EPC ratings, greater likelihood of needing upgrades. But they're also more likely to have a plan or funding for things like EPC improvements. So larger landlords have more maintenance obligations, but also more financial capacity generally to meet them over time. And one more point, 5, the use of letting agents. So 60% of large landlords use agents for all management. Only 21% of small landlords do. So this affects responsiveness, communication, and a tenant's experience, but not in the way you'd actually think. Lettings agents offer a less personal service, they found. Tenants often report better relationships with small, hands-on landlords. The data supports that self-managed landlords are more flexible. So are larger or smaller landlords better? I mean, it depends who you ask and what metric you use, but here's a fair summary from that very report. The data clearly shows it's often actually the smaller landlords, the ones that have 1 or 2 properties, who are more flexible, more personal, and less likely to evict or hike rents. They're the ones more likely to know their tenants by name, to hold off on a rent increase, to give people a chance when life gets messy. But guess what? They're also the ones leaving the market in droves. According to the government's own English private landlord survey, landlords with just 1 property were far more likely to be planning to sell, and the top reasons they gave were all of this increased regulation, reduced tax relief, and uncertainty around reforms like the Renters' Rights Bill. And who's staying? Well, you guess, the big boys, the corporates, the ones with 5, 10 or 50 properties, the ones more likely to evict, to push up rents, to treat tenants like numbers on a spreadsheet. So look, while the bill claims to be about protecting renters, what it's actually doing is pushing out the statistically better landlords and leaving behind the ones we're statistically more likely to not like. The bill will widen wealth inequality in the UK even more. It's the same pattern we've seen across other industries. The local coffee shop being buried by Starbucks. the family-run fish and chip place replaced by a soulless fast food chain. The black cab driver pushed out by Uber's algorithm. Why? Not because the big players are necessarily better, but because they could handle the red tape, absorb costs, and scale through systems. Wealth then rises to the top. And what do we lose in the process? Personal service, flexibility, local trust, local wealth. That's exactly what's happening in the rental market. It will grow wealth inequality because more of the wealth is filtering to fewer of the people. Next, let's talk about the economic doom loop. Neither party has really defined a way out of this. So let's talk economics, and I'll break it down. UK debt now exceeds 2.6 trillion, so it's almost 100% of GDP. Interest payments alone account for 110 billion a year. Madness, about 10% GDP, 10% tax revenue. Government borrowing remains about 150 billion a year. Neither Labour nor Conservatives have actually addressed how we escape this endless debt spiral, because it leads to higher debt, higher interest, higher taxes, lower disposable income, lower property affordability. Then the solution, the government just borrows more to try and break us out of this vicious cycle. So we're trapped in this pretty terrible cycle no one has an actual clear plan to get out of. It's equivalent of a business that keeps borrowing more and more and more to get business back on track. Each time it raises more money, it fails. In the private sector, that business would just go bust, you'd start again. But government, it's different. It doesn't go bust, hopefully. It just passes that bill on to you through higher taxes, weaker currency, eroding savings, and rising mortgage costs. And while the US is trying to export its way out with tariffs and the EU is doubling down on industrial subsidies, the UK, well, we're still debating whether to raise cut stamp duty. Neither party has proposed anything close to a proper economic reset or even basic reforms like tackling wasteful public spending, reforming tax to support growth, not kill it, and using more targeted tools to cool house prices without hammering the whole economy with high interest rates or high stamp duty rates. So until we stop treating symptoms with short-term fixes, this doom loop, this spiral keeps spinning. Let's talk about the next thing, demographic disaster, the baby boomer property flood. Here's the ticking time bomb nobody's really addressing, and to be honest, I've not fully got my head around how bad the implications of this could be. I kind of go back and forth as to how bad it could get. But baby boomers, so those born between 1946 and 1964, own over 3.2 trillion of UK housing wealth. They're now aged between 59 and 79. By the mid-2030s, there'll be an unprecedented wave of property sales as they retire, as they downsize, as they sadly pass away. Over 65s own 62% of UK property, but only 4.9% of mortgages. All this could lead to an estimated 25% increase in homes listed for sale. The concern is that could overwhelm the property market. Now, do you think Labour or Conservatives have any sort of policy for managing this wave? Of course not. Managing the real risk of population collapse. Bear in mind, we need a birth rate of 2.1 children per woman to sustain a stable population. Just take a look at this graph. We're tracking way behind that, and everyone is ignoring the most predictable crash of the century that this will cause. Or are they? Perhaps their plan has been legal immigration all along to make up the numbers. So look, what can you do? What can I do? Be cautious in this unstable market. Don't speculate. Keep watching market fundamentals, not political promises. Neither Labour nor Conservatives alone will be able to solve this. Real solutions need collaboration, fresh thinking, and long-term policy, not just quick fixes. Until then, it's up to us to navigate wisely. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. Why is all the wealth leaving the UK? Are we a sinking ship? Who do you trust the UK housing market with? Labour, Conservatives, neither, someone else? Let's discuss in the comments, and like and subscribe because it helps, and I'll see you in the next video up here.